Can Israel ignore the pressure? Young people outraged by the graphic images of the Rafah tent fire that killed dozens of civilians out in the streets of Paris and Marseille for 3 nights running. This the same week that Ireland, Norway, and Spain ratified recognition of a Palestinian state, and international courts mount cases over the war in Gaza, a war that could last another 7 months, says the National Security Advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu. Fact is, Israeli citizens are also traumatized by October 7th and its aftermath, but they're not seeing the same images as the rest of the world on their social media feeds. Then there's Israel's biggest backer, with a Biden administration that so far refuses to say that Israel's operation in Rafah crosses its red lines, and a Republican opposition in Washington that's 100% behind Netanyahu. In past Middle East wars, it's often the United States that's been the one to call time. Why, after nearly 8 months, is it not the case this time? Today in the France 24 debate, the mounting international pressure on Israel. And joining us from Istanbul is political analyst Jasmine El-Gamal, former Middle East advisor at the U.S. Defense Department. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Political scientist Stephen Ekovich is professor emeritus at the American University of Paris. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks for the invitation.
John Linden, executive director of the civil society umbrella group, the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. It's an AI-generated image that within days has been shared nearly 50 million times on Instagram. The All Eyes on Rafa graphic. You can see the letters resemble displaced people's tents. It follows last Sunday's fire in Gaza's southernmost city during an air raid that left at least 45 civilians dead. John Linden, how much have you seen this All Eyes on Rafah image make the rounds?
It's been all over social media over recent days, and then, a little like you said, it creates different impressions depending upon who's viewing it. So in Israel, the fact that prominent Iranians, including I think Ayatollah Khamenei, shared it became the story rather than the image itself. We know that eyes weren't on Rafah in Israel and aren't. People are, as you mentioned, are still very much focused on the Israeli trauma. But then the rest of the world has been focused on truly horrific images and videos that many of us wish we didn't see from the strike that took place on Sunday night.
This social media image, that this simple image that's making the rounds, Jasmine El-Gamal, over the last nearly 8 months, we've asked, is this a turning point? Is this a turning point? I have to ask the question again, is this a turning point?
That's right, Francois. It's the same question that we've been asking over and over again. And obviously, every time you think that this is the turning point, it ends up not being so. The image that you're seeing, obviously, even though it's an AI-generated image, has been shared, I think, around 45 million times, as you just said. And it's because people are frustrated. People don't know what to do with their shock and their anger and their despair at what they're seeing on their television screens. You rightly pointed out that people inside of Israel are not quite seeing the same images that people outside of Israel are seeing. And so there's a discrepancy there between the realities that different people are living in around the world. You have the majority of Israelis really living in that, people I know in Israel say every day for us is October 8th. And they're still living in that trauma, whereas what the rest of the world is seeing has been these 8 months of intense, immense bombardment, strikes, things that the ICC has now, both the ICC and the International Court of Justice has described as potential genocide, or at the very least war crimes, or both. And so what you're seeing right now is people really starting to question if this is not it, if this is not the red line. And by the way, President Biden had said that going into Rafah would be a red line. Then what possibly is? And the way the White House is trying to backtrack on that is by saying that what they believe to be a major ground operation is thousands and thousands of tanks and Israeli troops into Rafah, which we're not seeing so far. That's how John Kirby put it the other day. the National Security Council spokesperson. So what you're seeing is the administration really trying to walk back what it said, not be forced to address the fact that Israel has in fact crossed every red line that the US has set and disregarded every piece of advice that the Biden administration has given it so far for 8 months.
Yeah, we're going to hear that clip of John Kirby in a moment. But first, just to say, there's been mounting pressure that's been felt in lots of places, including right here in Paris. We've had a third night of protests cheered on by the far left, who've made the Palestinian cause a centerpiece of their campaign for next week's European elections. Last week, a member of parliament from the Unbowed France party got a 2-week suspension from the National Assembly. He'd broken House rules by brandishing a foreign flag, the Palestinian one, inside of the chamber.
I myself came from Marseille's north and became a member of parliament in France. And I take on my responsibilities by supporting the highest institutions of France and the whole world that have asked for a ceasefire. But on the other hand, I point the finger at France and what's happening there because they continue to sell arms to Israel, which means they are complicit in the massacre.
Stephen Ekovich, it's been heated, we were saying before we went on air, between students. And your reaction to the fact that we had a campus movement, classes have broken up, and now we're seeing these nightly rallies this week in France.
Okay, but the question, we come back to the question, is this going to make a difference? And I doubt it. I think the Israelis will do what they believe they have to do, despite the decisions of these international courts, despite these images, despite rallies in major cities. So I just don't think this is going to change the Israeli perspective. I think the Israelis probably see this and understand this as they understand the undertones of anti-Semitism on this. They see double standards. Where was the international uproar when we, that is, the United States, France, the UK, and our Arab allies destroyed 80% of Raqqa to destroy the headquarters of Daesh, who were at war against us? It was the same kind of battle. Where was the uproar during the Battle of Mosul? Same question. Where was it? Where was the uproar when we have Saudis killing thousands and thousands in Yemen with the help of the United States? So I think the Israelis see these different standards. They can say when Muslims kill Muslims, where's the uproar? When we kill Islamic terrorists, where's the uproar? But when Jews do it in Gaza, we have an international uproar. So I think that this is how Israelis understand it, and I think there's something credible in this. So I think we have to be careful if we look at the long history here about our judgment of the Israeli operation and what the Israelis intend to do.
A lot of this is playing out, of course, in real time on people's timelines, as we said at the outset. We're joined by our Jerusalem correspondent, Iris Makler. Thanks for being with us here in the France 24 debate, Iris.
Pleasure.
Since October 7th, Israel's barred the international press from Gaza. Images from local stringers and correspondents instead. These are handout images from the Israeli army from earlier this Thursday in Rafah. If the international press had been let in, would that have made a difference, Iris? To what Israelis were looking at and what images they were seeing?
I doubt that, and I'll tell you why. It seems to me that there's actually a policy here of keeping the suffering of Gaza from Israeli TV screens. And it doesn't matter who shoots it, because there are stories on CNN, there are stories on MSNBC, there are stories on Al Jazeera, but you don't need to go as far as Al Jazeera, none of which make it to Israeli television. None of the footage that comes, or almost none, I would say, of the daily footage that you and I see, that the Western world sees, it's not seen here. I have not been able to get to the bottom of this. Is it an imposition from the government? Have all the media companies got together and decided it amongst themselves? I haven't received a firm answer, but it's definitely a policy. And I've read a very interesting piece by an Israeli activist and thinker, really, who was a left-wing politician at one stage, Ksenia Svetlova, and she said there's an empathy deficit, that both sides are so full of their own pain that they can't see the pain of the other side. So you see in the Palestinian arena that they simply don't hear about what happened on October the 7th or choose not to believe it and to deny any of the facts then. And since then, you don't see or hear much of Palestinian suffering on Israeli television.
And so, Iris, I mean, let's just in the past week, right, we've had I know it's mostly symbolic, but still, Ireland, Spain, and Norway recognize a Palestinian state. You have the social media campaign that we talked about. You have the cases being brought up in international courts. Is it as Stephen Ekovich describes it, us versus them? Is that simply it's dismissed as they're all against us?
There's a lot of that. They're all against us, definitely. Some people take a practical view, which is let's leave aside the international courts and look at the recognition of a Palestinian state. They say it is only symbolic because it's a recognition of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and in Gaza, united under the Palestinian Authority. Well, that hasn't been possible since 2007, when that war between Hamas and Fatah began, which has never really been sorted out since. So they look at that on a practical level. Then they look at the history of the United Nations decisions against Israel, singling out Israel in a way that they don't single out other nations, and they do manage to dismiss it. So yes, us against them is a very good way of putting it. And they do see some anti-Semitic tropes in these, in what we see at the universities around the globe. And that allows them not to look at anything else.
Iris Makler, many thanks for being with us here in the France 24 debate. When Spain's parliament ratified the recognition of a Palestinian state this week, the deputy prime minister, who hails from a far-left party that's in coalition with the ruling socialist, turned heads with an oft-used slogan.
We live at a time in world history when doing the bare minimum is both heroic and insufficient. That is why we cannot stop. Palestine will be free from the river to the sea.
From the river to the sea, that slogan, does that mean that she's against the existence of the state of Israel, John Linden?
I mean, it's a little discouraging for a senior diplomat for a European Union member state who supports a two-state solution to use a slogan that is usually not associated with a two-state solution. Now, I don't think every time it's used, it's inherently anti-Semitic, as some people say. I think sometimes it is. Very often it's about liberation and about freedom for Palestinians. A friend of mine in the United States said he wished the slogan was, "From the river to the sea, Palestinians would be free," and that might engender more support. But if you support a two-state solution, I would say that probably isn't the most obvious slogan to be using as you're recognizing a Palestinian state that is going to sit next to the state of Israel. I think it's indicative of a bigger problem. There's so much symbolism and posturing and politics being played here with the lives of Israelis and Palestinians. We have the biggest loss of life in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict playing out in front of our eyes, on our screens. And we have people including my country in Ireland, but others too, who are seeing it through a domestic political prism very often. In the United States, you can see that very, very acutely. And in a way, it's just dehumanizing. It's not seeing Israelis and Palestinians as fully rounded human beings who are going through trauma, terror, both of them. I'm not equalizing it, but each are having the worst moments of their lives right now. And I think for those that are recognizing a state of Palestine, which, I reject the accusations that this is somehow anti-Semitic or extreme, but it's insufficient, right? Like, it's okay, fine. That's a symbolic act you take, but it's missing the chapter that I think most actors have put very little time and thought into. It's like, we understand what's happening right now. Sensible people understand this war needs to be ended as soon as possible, and the hostages need to be released and returned to their families. And sensible people agreeing where we need to get to, which is a two-state solution, an end to military occupation, freedom, security, and justice for both peoples. I hear almost nothing about what is supposed to happen in the big, messy middle part between solving the immediate crisis and getting toward an end game. And that's where I'd love to hear senior diplomats, foreign ministers, prime ministers and presidents actually focusing their attention, because that's our obligation from a distance, from safety, from security, to help Israelis and Palestinians with that.
Okay, well, introducing then Exhibit B, Israel's foreign minister replying to Yolanda Diaz. He trolled the Spanish. Israel Katz tweeting an image that mixes flamenco dancers and Palestinian militants with an attack on October the 7th. It's a meme. You need to click on it, and you see some somewhat, not fully, but somewhat graphic images in there with those flamenco dancers. He's not a stupid man, Stephen Ekovich, the Israeli foreign minister. He's catering to his base.
Of course, and it's awkward. And we have a lot of awkward expressions.
So it's the opposite of what John Linden was just describing.
Yeah. And look, it's easy, I would say, to vote to recognize a Palestinian state. It's going to take a very long time to build a Palestinian state, one that can really govern itself, that has good governance. So a lot of this is gestures on the part of Spain or eventually France or others, or even other countries in the region. Of course, they're for a Palestinian state. They don't want a Palestinian state where Hamas has any role, that's for sure. And the Palestinian Authority hasn't shown it's capable of putting together a Palestinian state with decent governance either. So, okay, let's vote for a Palestinian state. Easy. Building a Palestinian state, as you said, that's a whole other thing. And how many years will it take us to get there? And who's going to help the Palestinians do this now? Who can be the intermediaries for that?
In a vacuum, Steve, with respect, I mean, the global institutions found that the Palestinians were ready for statehood over a decade ago. And we currently have members of the Israeli government that are very clearly, this isn't a conspiracy theory, they're saying it. They're trying to destroy the Palestinian Authority. So it's hard to build the institutions of statehood. And the PA has its own problems with corruption and mismanagement and everything else. But when there's active people who are trying to destroy your state-building project, that's challenging. And, if you zoom out, you have secular nationalists, for all their flaws, who are saying we want to use non-violence and diplomacy to achieve statehood. That is a very moderate agenda in general terms.
They aren't very numerous.
But it's dynamic. And then you have terrorists who are using violence and kidnapping and sexual violence, saying they're going to liberate all of Palestine. Now, we ran a poll on 15 to 21-year-old Israelis and Palestinians a couple of years ago. And one of the findings, actually a year ago, and one of the findings that jumped out was that 62...
The Israeli Palestinians? Or the...
Israeli Jews, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Yeah. And the stat that jumped out to us is that 62%, an outright majority of Palestinian youth in the West Bank, are totally politically unaligned. They're not Fatah, they're not Hamas, they're not PIJ, they're not third parties. They're up for grabs. That's very unusual in a society like Palestine, where people tend to have tribal and political allegiances. Where they land is going to determine the next few decades for Palestinians. So we want to empower moderate, non-violent diplomatic paths towards freedom, liberation, and security, and disempower people like Hamas and the vision that they have.
Jasmine El-Kamal, then, what's your takeaway? Because, it's a majority of nations at the UN that recognize a Palestinian state. We heard the likes of Spain and Ireland state that what they want is effectively a two-state solution, everything that's been talked about since 1992 and even before. So did this mostly symbolic recognition advance the cause of peace, or when you're faced with that us versus them mentality, make no difference?
Thanks, Francois. There's so much to unpack here, so let me try to get through it all. It's a bit hard not being in the studio.
I wish you were here.
I know. So look, I want to say a couple of things. First of all, it's not quite just a symbolic move. I mean, this is a move that was done after a lot of thinking and a lot of consideration on the part of those three governments, and we will see more to follow, who will also recognize a Palestinian state unilaterally. And that is because there is no partner on the Israeli side for negotiations. We've heard this term being said again and again, over and over for years about the Palestinians. We've never really heard it really take root and really be understood that it's not just the Palestinians that have been reluctant at times to sign on the dotted line. This Israeli government under Netanyahu, you have the extremists like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, you have Eli Cohen, you have all of these people who have said again and again and again, they do not want to see a Palestinian state. How do you negotiate with someone like that? How to negotiate with a partner like that? You can't. And so this unilateral recognition was more than just a symbol. It is basically saying, the Israelis are not going to negotiate for a two-state solution right now. They are a problem, and we believe in the fundamental right of the Palestinians to have their own state, and we are going to recognize that and move forward as such. And so so that's the first point that I want to make. The other point really that I want to make about the discussion over the last few minutes is that I feel like we're talking a lot about terminology and about words when there is an actual erosion of Palestinian life, of Palestinian institutions, of homes, of universities. There's not one standing university left in Gaza. And we're talking about who is going to run a Palestinian state. Why aren't we talking about who is going to be in that state in the first place? Palestinians right now, as Jews did after October 7th, and Israelis particularly, feel that they are being existentially threatened and that their very existence is on the line. And there's not enough focus on that because everything else comes after securing that existence. I am shocked, frankly, that 8 months into this war, with what we've seen, that we are still talking about double standards against Israel and talking about anti-Semitism. There is very real anti-Semitism in the world today, and we should all be speaking out against it and fighting against it. That has nothing to do with what the Israeli government is doing and the IDF is doing in Gaza. We should be able to say both. We should be able to say anti-Semitism is wrong and it should not be allowed to fester the way it has been. We can also say at the same exact time that 17,000, 18,000 children, tens of thousands of children, not just killed, but maimed and burned and traumatized and orphaned, is not anti-Semitism. That criticism is not we should be able to do both. And just because I don't know about you, but I saw a lot of uproar when the US was attacking Mosul and Raqqa, and when the US was invading Iraq, and when the Saudis were bombing Yemen. There was a lot of uproar, as there should have been, and as there is now, as there should be now. So lastly, I know I'm taking quite a bit of time, but I do just want to say very quickly, Francois, that when we talk about the phrase from the river to the sea, it is an incomplete discussion without mentioning the number of Israeli ministers and government officials who use the same exact term, not to say someone will be free, but to say that there will be only one state between the river and the sea, and that is the state of Israel. So if we're going to have that discussion about that term, which frankly I find meaningless given what's happening on the ground right now, we should be able to talk about everyone who's using that term and the different ways they're using it.
Let's listen, if you will, to the French president. Emmanuel Macron was speaking on Tuesday during a state visit to Germany, saying he's all for following the example of Ireland, Norway, and Spain and recognizing a Palestinian state when the time is right.
There are no taboos for France, and I am totally ready to recognize the Palestinian state. But I've always said from the outset, and this is what I explained against last Friday to all the foreign ministers from the region who came to Paris and with whom we work on the Arab initiative, I believe that this recognition must come at a useful time. That is to say, at a time when it is a part of a process to which the states in the region and Israel have committed to, and which can produce a useful result also on the basis of a reform of the Palestinian Authority.
So Jasmine Al-Kamal, at a useful time and on the basis of a reform of the Palestinian Authority, your reaction?
When is a good time, and who decides when the time is right, Francois, for a nation to be free and to have a sovereign government that protects it, that governs it? I mean, when is the right time? I find these phrases it's so insulting. I mean, I'm trying to find a better word than insulting, right? It's an understatement. Who decides when is the right time? The time for recognition of a Palestinian state and the right of Palestinians to have a passport, just like everyone else, that says the state of Palestine, that dignity that they are so desperately seeking, the time is now. And by the way, I have to just pause and just give a huge shout out to John Linden and his organization, the Alliance for Middle East Peace. ALMEP has been doing incredible work with Israeli and Palestinian peace builders. I'm a huge fan of their work. And so thank you, John, for everything that you do in that regard. Francois, when we talk about a Palestinian state, it is not up to outsiders to say whether or not the right time is now. What we should be doing as an international community, and I say this as a former U.S. government official, is doing everything we can to set the conditions for a lasting peace. Now, again, that means support to organizations that need it, support to government institutions that need it, a demand for the rising up to the standards of a government that can engage in the practice of negotiations towards peace. Those are the kinds of helpful things that the international community should be doing, not opining about whether or not it's the right time for Palestinians to have their own state. And, it's frankly, I hear this over and over again, and that really, as you can tell, bothers me, because I don't think that's a very constructive way to go forward. But I will repeat what I said before. What matters now is securing the existence of Palestinians before there are no more Palestinians left to even talk about.
John Linden, when it comes to Emmanuel Macron, his position has evolved since October the 7th. He's the president, by the way, of a country that's home to Europe's largest Jewish population and largest Muslim population.
Yeah, and I think he also has an opportunity as probably the leading statesperson in Europe to try and kind of break out new ground that kind of builds on something that Jasmine was saying, and I really appreciate.
For her, it's not far enough, she's saying.
No, but I'm also saying that President Macron's not there, right? I mean, he has been saying we'd recognize a Palestinian state at a time of that is useful for many years. It's not a new statement. He's going to the G7. In a couple of weeks' time in Italy. He's going as a president who's in his second term, who's seen as a sort of strident foreign policy voice, and he has an opportunity to do something that Jasmine was hinting at in her comments earlier, to put the work of civil society peace builders right at the core of any meaningful strategy. Number one, to end this war and to get those hostages home and to end the destruction that we are seeing on the ground day to day in Rafah. But number two, to build underneath the political sort of top line, the foundations, the movements that can really work to end this conflict. Like just in this week, one of our members standing together, a group of Palestinian and Jewish citizens of Israel have been escorting trucks filled with aid through the West Bank and into Gaza that are being attacked by Israeli extremists who are looking to destroy the aid. Police and soldiers were looking on and allowing them to do it. Civil society turned up and got that food into Gaza to children who need it, who are in famine conditions in the north of the Gaza Strip. Imagine we scale that work X10, X100. So I would call on President Macron, do whatever you're going to do around recognition, give the speeches you're going to give about a diplomatic horizon, but empower those voices on the ground who are able to actually shape it and make it real. And a final note on this, the largest population of Jews and Muslims anywhere in Europe who are currently at each other's throat over this issue. Imagine we created, and not need to create it, it exists. Imagine we scaled exponentially groups of Jews and Palestinians working in the region for justice, equality, peace, self-determination that are based on values that they share rather than their ethnicity or their passport. Imagine that we could then have French and European citizens being in solidarity with them. Rather than making a binary that divides people here in Europe based on their diaspora identity, you could be in solidarity with people who share your vision and your values regardless of their ethnicity. That would do more to counter anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on this continent than any speech President Macron could give. So, and he can do that at the G7 in 2 weeks' time.
That's imagining a lot, and I hope he can make a speech like that. But we tend to forget the domestic politics in all of this. Why the heads of states and heads of governments are decided now, for example, to recognize a Palestinian state. There's an election coming up in Ireland. Yes. There are European elections now. We always too frequently overlook the internal, domestic sides of why these kinds of decisions are being taken. Look, recognizing a Palestinian state now makes October 7 a pogrom National Liberation Day for the Palestinians. That's very, very difficult to accept by Israelis. That's impossible for Israelis to accept. That's why it cannot be now. It can be sometime, but recognizing it now just legitimizes a pogrom on October 7th as the Palestinian Day of Liberation. That's not possible for Israelis, and it's not possible for a lot of other heads of state either.
Is it, Stephen Ekovich, when you look at the G7 nations, most of them, the European ones, they have a past with World War II. Countries like Ireland and Spain, not so much, not directly involved. Is it also because of the past?
Of course it is, and France has a past also with anti-Semitism. And we have to take that into consideration. And it's a heavy past with anti-Semitism in France. And it's still there, and it's palpable. It's not an undercurrent in French
Is that, Jasmine Al-Kamal, what makes this impossible? Because we're talking about the international reaction in this discussion. And is that what makes this impossible? Is that because of the fact that there is this weight of the past?
I think, Francois, what makes this impossible, or at least much harder than it should be, is that too many people, leadership especially, are creating these false dichotomies, this false zero-sum game that if this side wins, then the other side has to lose. If you acknowledge this side's trauma, then the other side's trauma doesn't exist. I agree with what John is saying, and I have been saying this. This is what my work is based on. It's based on empathy. It's based on putting yourself in someone else's shoes. It's about recognizing that just because you acknowledge someone else's pain doesn't mean yours doesn't exist, and that we can do both at the same time. We can acknowledge both people's histories, both people's traumas, and both people's fundamental right to a state, to a sovereign state. I don't agree with Professor Ekovich that it would be a slap in the face to Israelis to recognize a Palestinian state right now, simply because of the fact that that a Palestinian state, a two-state solution, is actually the last thing that Hamas wants. Mm-hmm. To say that we acknowledge a Palestinian state and that we are moving forward two states for two peoples is the opposite. It's saying terror doesn't work. It's saying occupation doesn't work. That is what it's saying. And if you choose to look at it that way, too many people don't choose to look at it that way. They choose to make it zero-sum. This is a far less zero-sum conflict than people make it out to be.
Jasmine, we promised you we would get back to the role of the United States in all of this. So here we go. On the hashtag F24 debate, Francisco stating that Israel will ignore the pressure if the U.S. continues to send weapons. For the Biden administration, well, the tipping point is not yet.
We still don't believe that a major ground operation in Rafah is warranted. We still don't want to see the Israelis, as we say, smash into Rafah with large units over large pieces of territory. And we haven't seen that at this point. But we're going to be watching this, of course, very, very closely.
Stephen Ekovich, why is that the U.S. position?
Well, we can go back to domestic politics and history. The United States has been a supporter of the security and the existence of Israel forever, since the creation of the State of Israel. President Biden also has to take into consideration.
I mean, this was on Tuesday, so yeah. The news of this tent fire that killed at least 45 was still raw.
Yeah, but you've seen the most recent news, and have you seen the Israeli briefing? That was an unintended fire. The fire.
The end result is the same. In any case.
No, but still, I mean,
it happened on Israel's watch.
Okay, it happened on Israel's watch, but it was not a strike inside the camp that set off that fire.
But only bad things can happen when you have war in heavily populated areas.
Of course. So you can try your best and things.
So the question is, the U.S. seems an outlier seen from here in Europe when it comes to pressuring for a ceasefire? Because it's up to them in the end to pressure for a ceasefire.
I doubt even if the United States presses for a ceasefire, I doubt that the Israelis are going to go for it. Look, the Israelis and this government will do what it believes it has to do to eliminate Hamas, and that's one of the goals of the war, is to eliminate Hamas as a governing institution and Hamas's military capabilities. That's one of the goals. And I think they're probably going to continue until they get to that point, or as close to that point as possible. Look, it's okay for the United States to say, or the world to say, the United States should stop supplying Israel with weapons. Okay, let's ask Iran to stop supplying Hamas with weapons. Iran to stop supplying Hezbollah with weapons. We have another double standard here.
It's about getting to a ceasefire at this point.
No, we're not going to. Look, it seems very implausible. I would be very surprised if we get to a ceasefire at this point.
All right.
A ceasefire, in Israeli eyes, only helps Hamas.
Let's get back to what the U.S. position is, perhaps by looking at Israeli domestic politics as well. Benjamin Netanyahu is got what's called a war cabinet. He's in coalition of sorts with Benny Gantz, the leader of the opposition, after October 7th. Gantz was given the prime minister until June 8th to convince him that there is a plan for what happens next. Otherwise, he quits and tries to trigger early elections. Sooner than later, please, says the other opposition figure in the war cabinet, Gadi Eisenkot, who's lost a son and a nephew in combat since October the 7th, blasting Netanyahu in a Wednesday speech, saying questions arise, rightfully so, about how to end this war. John Linden, is the U.S. position about the fact that a blank check for Israel no matter what? Or is the U.S. position, why should we stick our necks out when this is happening next week?
I think maybe it's the latter, but I mean, there was a red line that everybody heard about an operation in Rafah. It wasn't ambiguous. And the two reasons that the United States include, like every single ally of Israel, friends of Israel, said, do not have an operation in Rafah because there will be mass casualty events amongst over 1 million displaced people. And there's a risk of some kind of a miscalculation or an accident between the Egyptian army and the Israeli army along the Rafah border. Both of those things happened within 24 hours. The people that made these warnings were correct, and they were doing so with regards to actually looking for Israel's best interests, as well as the destitute human beings sheltering in Rafah. So I think that the United States, I don't know this, I think they've clearly moved the goalposts a little bit in the hope that something politically is going to happen next week. Israel is taking control of the Philadelphia corridor on the Rafah border. They have uncovered tunnels. They maybe are manufacturing or creating a context where they can say that this is what victory in Rafah looks like. And I think it's worthwhile noting the debate inside Israel. I mean, on the one hand, the images and the reality of what's happening in Gaza are completely absent. Like Iris said earlier on, it's really terrible. It's dehumanization in both societies, but the absence of victimhood in either's perception of what's going on. But the debate about the operation is actually much more fierce than we've had today.
Including why didn't they go for the Philadelphia corridor months ago?
At the very start, when they were advised, apparently by the United States and by the United Kingdom, that's what they should have started with. Gadi Eisenkot, who you spoke about earlier, has now for 10 weeks been calling for the prioritization of a hostage deal and the release of hostages and a ceasefire rather than an operation in Rafah. He sits in the war cabinet, and this is what he's been saying. So there is much more multiplicity of positions than people might expect. And I think sometimes people advocating for Israel outside of Israel assume that whatever the government of Israel is doing, I have to defend, contextualize, and advocate for. That's not what friendship of a country or advocacy for it looks like. And similarly, on the Palestinian side, there's many people who will excuse, justify, or contextualize things that, for example, Hamas did in ways that are abhorrent and is no favor to the Palestinian cause or the Palestinian people. Our responsibility at a safe distance is to try and use that perspective to look shrewdly and with a little less emotion and say what's actually in both people's interest here right now.
Jasmine El-Gamal, when Joe Biden came into office, he knew there was no good way to leave Afghanistan. Better get this off the table fast. He did so. He got criticized, but now it's ancient history, right? Whereas in this case, he's gotten a re-election coming up. We know that he's got at some point to call time on this. Is it about just waiting another week?
You know what? I mean, Joe Biden has gotten himself to a situation where there's actually very little that he can do right now. I mean, as someone who's been advocating for better policies on this issue for the last 8 months, I actually don't think that there's much room for maneuver for him anymore. He's really gotten himself into a corner now because if you remember, he got so much criticism when he paused one shipment to Israel of weapons, of 2,000 and 3,000 pound bombs, that I think that I think that's partly why they're trying to walk back the red line now and try to redefine what the red line is. Instead of just going into Rafah, it's now thousands and thousands of tanks into Rafah, because President Biden knows that this close to the election, he can't be holding up any more shipments to Israel. Now, on the other hand, on the flip side, by not doing that, he's also potentially losing other votes, like the young vote, the African American vote, the Muslim American and Arab American vote, the anti-war vote. I mean, he's really managed to mess this up royally. And I think it's because from the very beginning, he truly, President Biden does feel, in his own words, an incredible amount of empathy with the state of Israel from way back, from, when he was 30 years old as a senator. And I do believe that clouded his judgment. Instead of being a good friend to Israel, like John said, and trying to point out that they were going to end up exactly where we are now, where Hamas is no more weakened than it was back in October 7th. They are reconstituting, they are shooting rockets at Israel, and that the Palestinian civilians are the ones who have borne the brunt of this war. And by the way, no less importantly, that the hostages have not been returned and are dying under that Israeli bombardment as well. This is going to be, look, I don't like being dramatic. I am being much less forceful than I think that we should be being right now because of the gravity of the situation. But I will tell you that if Israel's goals were to destroy Hamas, this will go down as one of the most failed campaigns in history, because that is not going to be the outcome of this war. If you go by the other stated goals that other Israeli ministers were talking about, including the defense minister and the prime minister, of depopulating Gaza and moving people into the Sinai, they're much closer to those goals than they are of defeating Hamas.
Will we have change from Joe Biden?
Look, Joe Biden did not create this situation. He did not create this mess.
But he can call time on it.
How is he going to do that?
By stopping the send weapons.
It's not going to happen. Look, Joe Biden is facing a situation he did not create. The situation is both a domestic political situation in the United States, as well as in the region, and as well as between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
He wants to get reelected. What should he do?
What he should do is what he's doing now. He's trying to balance all of that and trying to finesse it and to nuance it. What else could you do? He is not going to take a clear and distinct position one way or another and lose one electorate or the other electorate. What he's doing is what a skilled politician will try to do, and will try to balance all the different forces in order to not alienate an important part of the electorate for his re-election to the president.
But he's losing votes the whole time while he does that in both directions. So it's clearly not satisfying.
That's not clear. That's not clear.
You're
at
right.
all.
It's not. The polls would indicate.
Yeah.
I mean, just as respectfully as an alternative, what he can do is actually sketch out a grand vision, right? Rather than this kind of managerial sort of giving one to one side, something to the other, and really not satisfying either side of a very polarized debate in the United States. I mean, number one, bringing the war to an end and getting the hostages home would probably give him the largest bump that he's going to get on a foreign policy issue this side of the election. But number two, to speak about what the United States is going to do with regards to ending this war, but also a vision for really transforming the lives of Palestinians and Israelis. Only the United States can actually lead a process like that. But doing it alongside the Arab states, the Europeans, others, that can really instill some sense of hope or optimism.
That will be the final word for now.
Yeah,
John Linden,
and that can
thanks.
happen afterwards, and it should happen afterwards.
Inshallah.
Stephen Ekovich, thank you. And I want to thank you, Jasmine Al-Gamal, for joining us from sunny London for this conversation. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.